As you remember, last week we started a new series dealing with some of what, I consider life's most difficult questions. And for each question, we're using a different part of Job to kind of ferret out some answers. Now, that's what we'll be doing right up to Palm Sunday. And during the first message, we're looking at that simple, modest, easily answered little question: why do bad things happen to good people? And we talked about last week how sometimes good people suffer because of what they've done to themselves, or what's been done to them by others, but at other times, there just doesn't seem to be any rhyme and reason for their pain. Sort of like what happened when God allowed Satan to take away everything from Job, a righteous man, to show Satan that he'd remain righteous. In other words, sometimes suffering is just not fair. It just happens. And it just happens because it does. Now, I recognize that's not a great answer, but it's the only one we got. But as we talked about last week, whether we can understand it or not, whether our answers are good or not, I think it's important for us to remember three things. First, we've been cleansed and forgiven by God. Therefore, we're not bound to keep repeating the past like Bill Murray did in Groundhog's Day. And second, our future has been secured. Therefore, whatever's happening now is temporary. And third, we can be confident that God is with us all the time. Now, that's what we talked about last week. And today, we're going to consider another question, the second on our list. Why don't people understand me? Of course, anyone who's ever lived with a teenager has probably heard this kind of question before. I mean, even prior to my becoming a father, I was a high school teacher. Therefore, I already knew that any time a teenager didn't do what was expected, or maybe reacted in an extreme way to something that both a preteen and a post-teen would consider pretty insignificant, I mean, whenever that kind of thing happened, the problem wasn't with her friends or with herself or even with the situation she was facing. No, sir, the problem was with me and my total inability to understand what was going on, what she was going through. And for that reason, any advice I might give or any suggestion I might offer could be immediately rejected. Because you see, I'm ignorant. I live under this great big rock. I don't understand. At least that's what they tell me. Now that's what I learned, a lesson that's been reinforced over these last 2 years. But having said that, I really don't want to suggest that the question, why don't people understand me, that is only asked by folks going through adolescent hormonal changes. As a matter of fact, I think we might all find ourselves asking this exact same question from time to time. Something we can see happening all around us. I'm telling you, from time to time, we all wonder. It's part of life why people just don't seem to understand us. And even though sometimes the issue we're facing is trivial, and it is, and even unimportant even to us, at other times it's not. For example, it may involve the same kind of situation Job faced, when he tried to share the undeserved, unfair, and unexplainable suffering he was enduring to his closest friends. And they all kind of blew him off. I mean, the more Job told them that his suffering had broken the fundamental rule he had followed since birth, and how he had lived what really was a righteous life, something we know is true, and that in spite of God, that God had allowed horrible things to happen to him and his family. Man, the more he shared the sheer injustice of what he was facing, not only couldn't his friends understand what he was saying, they accused him of lying. For them, God couldn't and wouldn't allow a righteous person to suffer for no reason. That wasn't possible. At least not in their minds. Therefore, Job must have done something wrong. He must have done something bad. He must have done something to deserve what he was facing. And for his own good, he needed to admit it. And then he could just go off and die in peace. But of course, both Job and the reader, meaning us, we know they're wrong. I mean, we know that's not what happened. They just couldn't understand. And you know, when it happened to him, I think Job went through the same emotions we generally feel when people don't seem to understand us. I mean, as we read through this book, we're going to see that Job went through a lonely kind of sadness. And then a genuine irritation and frustration, and then an honest-to-goodness anger, both at his buddies and at God. When it appeared that not only did no one care that he was suffering, but that no one, including God, was even willing to explain why it was happening. You see, that's what happened to Job, and I think it also can happen to us. But I'll tell you, when it does, I think we can do more than just sit there in the ashes like Job did, arguing with guys who aren't going to listen anyway because they were too busy champing at the bit to talk. You see, I think we can understand why this kind of thing happens, why people sometimes don't understand us. But more than that, we can also get a pretty good idea about what we can do about it. And in my opinion, it all comes down to two verbs, will and can, and how they apply to the people around us. Now let me explain. When we're really struggling, and when this struggle is making us sad, and it's making us frustrated, and it's making us angry because we feel that no one understands what we're facing, no one understands us, I think it's important for us to remember that we're always, and I mean always, surrounded by four different kinds of people. For example, whether we like it or not, there will always be folks who both won't and can't understand us. You see, for some reason, they have made the definite decision that they will not understand. They're not going to understand what we're saying. They're not going to understand what we're facing. They're not going to understand what we're feeling. They're just not going to do it. Of course, they may have their reasons. Maybe like Job's friends, the stuff we're talking about doesn't fit into what they already believe. And they don't really need to listen. Or maybe they don't feel they have the time or the energy or the concentration to deal with someone else's problems. Or maybe, and get this is often the case, they just don't care. In other words, they don't think we're as important as we think we are. That's a possibility. But regardless of the reason, they're just not willing to understand. And that's actually all right, because they couldn't understand even if they wanted to. Let me give you an example. Back when I was in seminary, there was a guy in my class named Duncan. Now, Duncan had muscular dystrophy. He was limited to a wheelchair, and his time on earth was going to be brief. Now, that was Duncan's life. And I got to tell you, no matter how much I read about the disease, and no matter how much time I spent with Duncan, and no matter how kind and understanding I tried to be, I was never able to understand what he felt when he woke up in the morning. And when he rolled himself to class, and when he worked and studied, maybe harder than the rest of us, to do something he might never live to do, and he knew it. You see, what he faced was so foreign to my experiences, I don't think it was possible for me to understand what he went through every day. And I think that applies to a lot of situations, including some of the stuff you and I face. Some folks couldn't understand even if they wanted to And I'll tell you, when you combine this inability with a lack of desire, man, those folks are just about as close to a lost cause as you can get. I mean, they're probably not going to listen. And if they say anything at all, it's probably going to be brief and unrelated to what we're feeling. In fact, they're probably only going to increase our sadness. It's probably only going to increase our sadness, our frustration, our anger. And if we go to them for understanding more than once or twice and then leave feeling worse, which is going to happen, we really have only ourselves to blame. Because these people won't and they can't understand. Therefore, if we look to them for understanding, it's our fault. But there are others who could understand if they wanted, but have decided that they don't. These are the can but won't folks, and they may be even harder nuts to crack than the first bunch. You see, they really are able to identify with us. They can do it because we're facing something they already understand. Maybe they endured it themselves. I don't know. But it's really not important, because whether it's from a lack of time or energy or interest or concern, they've decided they will not be understanding. They are not going to be kind and considerate. They, like the first bunch, don't care. And even though I think it's possible to convince them to become more concerned, maybe I can change their minds and increase their compassion, frankly, I believe that's pretty unlikely. I mean, let's get real. If someone can identify with what we're facing and still just doesn't care, I think we may waste a lot of time trying to convince them to change their minds. And when we're feeling like Job and the sadness and the frustration and the anger is on the rise, time may be the one thing we don't have. And so unless we have some kind of martyr mentality or deep down really want to believe that no one does understand us, that no one really does care, I think we can move past both those who care, won't, and can't, right along with those who could but won't. But even if we mark these guys off our sharing list, there are two other kinds of folks we might want to approach. Folks that are out there around us all the time. You see, there are plenty of people around us who actually do care, who genuinely want to help us, understand us. Unfortunately, they just can't. In other words, they are willing to take the time. They're willing to make the effort. They're willing to offer direction and to offer support and to offer comfort. They want to do that. They just don't know how. They just don't know what to do, because what we're facing is different from anything they've ever experienced. Sort of like I was saying about Duncan. And I'll tell you, for those who want to understand but can't, man, it can be extremely frustrating. And I'm talking about for them as well as for us. But even though it won't be easy, I think we can help them with this identification problem. And we can do it by trying as best we can to understand their backgrounds and then to explain what we're facing in a way that relates to their experiences. In other words, if we can't understand what they're saying, we might need to speak with words and images that they can grasp. If they don't speak our language, we may need to speak theirs. And even though, like I said, that's certainly not easy, especially when we're kind of struggling, it's a whole lot easier than trying to convince somebody that they should care when they've already decided that they don't. I think those who are willing but not able have a greater potential to understand, and that's good. But I'll tell you what's even better. The best kind of folks for us, and I'm talking about the best kind of folks to us to turn to for help and support, are those who will and can. In other words, those who want and who are able to understand us. And I'll tell you, those folks are out there and we can spot them. In fact, we can identify them because they already care about us. They're already engaged in our lives. They already want to know us and to understand us better than they do. They're already concerned with what we're facing, and they're already willing to take the time and make the effort to offer whatever insight and sympathy they can muster. But more than that, they're also able to understand, to identify with our struggle, including our sadness and frustrations and anger. I'll tell you, they are the ones that may have walked in our shoes. They have already survived what we face. Good night. They may be the ones who have muscular dystrophy too and can understand exactly what living in Duncan's skin is like. In other words, they've been where we are. And because they also care, they're ready to listen. Man, they are ready to understand. And that should be good news for us. That should cause us to celebrate. This is great because now we have someone or someones with whom we can share without worrying about whether at some point they're going to start looking at their watches and rolling their eyes, or whether after sharing our story they're going to look at us like we either started talking in Portuguese or suddenly have lobsters crawling out of our ears. Man, those worries are gone. Therefore, we are free to share. But more than talking, we can also start listening. Listening to what they have to say. Listening to the words of comfort they'll offer, as well as the advice they'll give. And we can decide to trust what they're saying. Because we know that what they're saying comes from both the heart and the head. From a sincere concern and from actual experience. I'll tell you, these people can make a huge difference when we need to be understood. In fact, that may be one of the reasons why in the church, the body of Christ, God has drawn together so many different people into one place. And I'm talking about people with different backgrounds and who've gone through different experiences, but who are united by one command, that we love one another as we have been loved. And along with a God who is always present and who always loves and who can identify with us on our worst day, because remember, as the writer of Hebrews said, Jesus understands every weakness of ours because he was tempted in every way that we are, but he did not sin. God will and can understand us. And we can certainly be able to find the same among his people. Now, like I said earlier, I think at some point we don't have to be teenagers to wonder if there's anyone who will and who can understand how we feel. We don't have to be teenagers to feel that way. That hits us all. And when this happens, I also think it's natural to experience some sadness and some frustration, maybe even some anger. But I think we can avoid this grief when we recognize that some folks won't and can't understand, while there are others who could but won't, or who are willing but can't. But there are still others, hopefully right here in this community, who do want to understand and who can identify with us. And I'll tell you, those are the ones to whom we can go. Those are the ones to whom we can share. Those are the ones who will listen to us. And if we do, that can offer a lot of comfort when we feel like asking the question, why don't people understand me? Amen.